The subcommittee will reconvene. Thank you for still being here. And we go to the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Mrs. Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you for holding this hearing and welcome to committee.
You might need to put your mic on there or closer to you.
I'll get over closer to it.
Okay.
And again, welcome to the Commissioner Harbour. Let's see. The report makes several statements to support its conclusion that a 12 to 14 data exclusivity period is unnecessary. One statement is that there's no evidence that patents claiming a biologic drug product have been designed around more frequently than those claiming small molecules. And the other is that because there's no evidence about the lack of patentability of new biologic products, nor that market forces have been insufficient to incentivize their development, the Commission has not recommended a specific length for an exclusivity period. If there are no biosimilar pathways that exist, how could there be any evidence as to how patents could be worked around? Isn't the whole point that in a biosimilar world, patentability changes because the approval standard has been reduced from sameness to similarity?
Let me just say that in this market, we know that the follow-on biologic will resemble brand-to-brand competition. And we know that the patents are strong on biologic drugs. Now, your question was rather long, so I didn't get all of it, but I'm going to let Mr. Robleski answer what he heard, and then I'll come back and fill in.
Sure. Your question was to the extent that if there's no follow-on biologic, how can there be, if there's no pathway yet, how can there be any evidence? Well, what we looked at is the existing brand competition, because these markets are very large, and so there's plenty of opportunity for another branded competitor to come into the market, duplicate all the clinical and safety efficacy data, get a full new a new drug, and then compete. Well, we found that the patents have been so strong in so many of these markets that it's even kept out a branded competitor from doing just that.
So from creating a similar product that comes through a different pathway?
If you create the similar product, what you're doing is you're saying to the FOB, you don't have to do as much clinical testing, though you're still going to have to do some in order to be approved, and you can rely on the FDA's previous findings about the innovator drug, that it's safe and effective. You won't have to do as much. But if the patents have been strong to keep out the branded competitors, they're going to be equally as strong to keep out the follow-on competitors who have to be similar.
I guess you don't really make a recommendation as to what the period of exclusivity is, but just given the difference in the complexity of the drugs and all of the other factors, the length of time, the very specific processes that have to take place that may not be able to be duplicated, the amount of investment that has to be made, and why, can you just explain to me again why you would not provide for a longer period? It just seems, I mean, as a physician, I know that I would have a lot of difficulty. I had to adjust myself to generics, period, to begin with, because my patients, some of them wouldn't accept them even if I did. But because there may be immune differences in how a person reacts immunologically and the medication, why wouldn't you give these complex molecules with all of the other factors a longer period of exclusivity?
Let me take a stab at that. We feel that the patent protection and market-based pricing is enough. Why? First of all, the rationale for a 12 to 14-year branded exclusivity period basically would be to compensate for any perceived failures of the patent system, to reward and protect and to incentivize biologic drug innovation. But our report has not found any perceived failure. Therefore, we found that branded exclusivity was not necessary because the branded biologic manufacturers are likely to enter the market and earn substantial revenues even after follow-on entry. And the follow-on biologics are unlikely, when they do enter the market against the pioneer manufacturers, they're unlikely to price discount more than 10 to 30%. That means that the branded pioneer manufacturers are likely to maintain their first mover advantage. They will still retain 70 to 90% of their market share after the follow-on biologic enters. They're still making very excellent profits. And the biologic product has already, as I said, been incentivized through patent protection and market-based pricing.
Well, my time is up, so I'll, if there's another round, I may come back.
I want just to know we're not going to have another round, but thank you. Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some quick questions here. The comment you just made about 70 to 90%, they'll maintain the 79% of their market share, and they'll likely continue to reap substantial profits. What's the basis of that statement? Likely, what does likely mean?
The basis of the statement is the experience that we've seen so far in Europe in terms of how they have priced, and then with the limited experience that we've seen with the one example with Omnitrope here in the U.S., it's a biologic drug, but happens to be approved under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, so it's an exception. So when we looked at those, but then it's also based on, the Commission conducted a workshop in which we had all the biotech industry, we had the potential FOB competitors, we had the payors, the PBMs, and the...
Did you have the companies that actually do the research and development in the room? Did you have the companies that actually develop the new drugs in the room?
Yeah, oh, yes. Oh, yes. And
did they say that they thought with maintaining a 70%,
yes,
did they say with maintaining 70% market share they can continue to come up?
I couldn't even hear some of the comments you made. I don't know if the reporter could. Maybe don't repeat it now, but just stay close to that mic,
okay,
all right?
Okay, I'm almost swallowing it, but I will...
I'm sorry.
I mean, Mike, I understand that nearly 90% of biotech companies have remained unprofitable. In 2008, a third of them had less than 6 months cash on hand. They have to go out and get venture capital for these things, and if we say to the venture capitalists who are investing that they're going to reduce it by several years of return on investment here, that to have someone come through. Now, I wasn't in this room when everybody met. Let's take out the payers. Let's take out the FOBs who's going to benefit from this. Just the companies developing this. They said, yes, it's fine with us. Cut us down to 5 years and we can make do with this?
No.
Okay.
No.
What did they agree to?
They agreed to what the market effect would be of FOB entry.
And they're fine with it?
It was their research that...
Down to what level? Down to how many years exclusivity?
Say that again?
Down to how many years of exclusivity are they fine
What
with?
we were trying to do was analyze how competition was likely to develop. Once
But down to how many years exclusivity? Do they comment on that?
they have strenuously advocated for a 12 to 14-year period of exclusivity.
So they're okay if it stays 12 to 14 years and to have competition into the market there? Is that what they said they can still work this to
Say the
come up
last
with?
piece again, and
The 70-90% of their market share, but is that 70-90% of their market share? So let FOBs come in, but would that also still maintain some exclusivity for that 12 to 14 years?
what we had tried to do was to see how the competition was likely to develop, to determine whether...
Well, I only have 2 minutes left. I just need an answer. Are they agreeing, yes, we're okay with competition if we can keep the 12 to 14-year exclusivity, and that allows us to raise enough money in an unprofitable time to do research on new drugs?
I don't think they ever agreed that they would be able to keep 70 to 90%. It's just what the experience has shown that they would.
Well, I'm confused because I thought you said that they all met together and they told you they were supportive.
Everybody predicts that the effect of a follow-on biologic will be that they'll come in at a 10 to 30% discount, and if they do that, the brand or the pioneer is likely to retain 70 to 90% of its market share.
Okay, but I thought
we
you
looked
said...
at what that implication would be.
Look, I need an answer here. I'm not trying to be funny, but I don't want to dance around this because I want to make sure we have plenty of money to continue to develop life-saving drugs. That's what I want. Cheap drugs that don't cure anything are worthless. Expensive drugs that no one can afford are worthless. So I need to know, you talked about some people sat around, they agreed to something. What the heck did they agree to? And if they didn't, don't tell me they did. Are they saying that this 12 to 14-year exclusivity remains? Are they saying that they're okay with competition? Are they saying they're okay with making it 5-year exclusivity? What specifically do they say in 3 words or less? I just need an answer quickly.
They agreed that competition would be like a branded competitor. And we have ways to deal with branded competitors now.
Did they comment at all on the years of exclusivity? Or is your report not touching on to that?
No. It describes completely that they have put forth a model that shows that they need 12 to 14 years.
Okay, one other thing I want to ask real quick. The issue of similarity. So a molecule may change, this large molecule may change. We're not going to require the FDA to do testing on those?
We took it as a given that the FDA would approve a safe and effective product, whatever that required.
So the FDA may still require additional testing of some of these drugs?
And that's the reason why it's going to be so expensive to bring in an FOB.
Okay. So, I mean, just changing a molecule in something, I mean, you could change one molecule in the one atom, one molecule in the H2O formula and make something that's toxic versus something that's necessary. So I hope that's an important part of this whole report there. If that's something we could discuss more, perhaps you could elaborate on this for me, because it's something you made reference to in writing and also in your testimony here. I'd really like to know what that means, because that's going to be very important to understand how we can have a competitive marketplace and also make sure there is sufficient funding in here that we can keep moving forward and developing these new drugs. I'd be grateful for that, and the procedure would be let the chairman know, and we'll know from there.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Let me mention to you and to the members, and obviously, as always, you'll be able to pose questions in writing that we would ask you to respond to after the hearing. The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Eshoo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The first thing I'd like to start out with is to ask for unanimous consent to place in the record the comprehensive responses to every question raised by the subcommittee from the chief scientist of the FDA, Dr. Frank Torti, which was peer-reviewed, and second, the exhaustive economic analysis of data exclusivity of biologics by Henry Grabowski, whose name has been mentioned several times by several members on both sides of the aisle today. He is the director of the program in pharmaceuticals and health economics at Duke University. So I would ask that that these be placed in the record.
Let me just ask, these are the comments by the FDA under the Bush administration? Is that what they are?
Well, the FDA is the FDA.
No, I just want to make sure,
because
because I know we've asked.
Under, so.
I'm only asking because I know that we've asked the FDA, the current FDA too. But these are the ones from the previous, right? Why don't you just let me see the manifest.
You know what, Mr. Chairman, I think you know what I asked. I'm just asking for unanimous consent to place this in the record. If people want to read it, they will have access to it. If they think it's garbage, they can throw it out. It doesn't force anyone.
No, I agree.
Very
I'm just
simple
trying to
request.
verify what it is
Well,
again.
read it, and then you'll see. Do we have is there a unanimous consent to it?
Well, normally I'd like to know what it is before I agree.
I just read it into the record.
All right, tell me again, it's the FDA.
These are the comprehensive responses to the questions that the members of the subcommittee almost 2 years ago. Remember we had the meeting?
Right, but we've also asked them, these are the ones from the previous administration, 'cause we've asked them again in the current administration.
Well, you don't agree with what the FDA responded.
No, I just want to make sure that they're the ones
record.
from the previous administration. That's what we're talking about,
What's
right?
the date on it? It's September 18th, 2008.
Okay,
So
all
it's
right.
just before my candidate for president won.
All
okay?
right, so ordered.
In trying to read the report, digest it, and then analyze it in the unfair time frame that was established either by the FTC or by the committee, I don't know which it is, there's something that stood out to me, and that is throughout the report, throughout your report, you base the, you talk about obviously the generics that are the result of Hatch-Waxman, which we all celebrate, and this new attempt to use that framework, very broad framework, and apply it to biologics. But what you, I think, fail to state and then develop in the report is that under Hatch-Waxman, the compounds, the pharmaceuticals, must be identical. That is by law. Biologics, biosimilars, think of the two parts of that word, will be similar. They cannot be identical. I don't know what scientists you brought in to instruct you on this, but I have to say that to base your report, as I read it, I think it's deeply flawed because you base your outcome and your analysis of biosimilars on the previous regimen and the previous law, which is very different. I don't see where you have taken into consideration the differences between the two, which is what makes this case very complex. We have a regulatory framework today in which any new biologic will receive, and I want to move on because I want to ask my questions, but that's an observation. Any new biologic would receive 20 years of patent protection and no potential for biosimilar competition. Innovators and investors are assured that as long as their patents are in force, there's no possibility of a competitor going to the FDA, using the innovator's safety and efficacy record, and taking a shortcut to the market to compete against them. Now, we're proposing to move to a policy in which patents will remain in force, but competitors will be able to come to market to compete against an innovative product without going through a full-blown FDA review. As you point out in the report, this will cost a biosimilar manufacturer about 1/10 of the costs for an innovator or a non-biosimilar competitor to bring a product to market. Now, how can this not possibly change? How can this, because you say in your report that investment incentives won't change. How can this not possibly change the investment incentives in biotechnology? If a venture capitalist or a drug company is contemplating a new product for development, won't this fundamentally alter their risk/reward calculation? This has to have an examination, and I don't know where you leapfrog to. It's almost as if this doesn't exist, or that if we don't talk about it, we don't have to deal with it, therefore it doesn't exist. So I think that you need to answer that, and I want to bring out my next question as well. Your report states that a 12 to 14-year exclusivity period, this is quote, is unnecessary to promote innovation by pioneer biologic manufacturers, unquote. This position is based on your assumptions that patent workarounds will be no easier to accomplish for biologics than they have been for small molecule generic drugs. You also state that data exclusivity is only justified for products that are unpatentable. But I see no substantiation at all for these positions in your report. That's why I question whether past or present information about small molecule generics is a reliable predictor for biologics. And that's why I question the basis for your assumptions. We have absolutely no experience, and I want to repeat that. We have absolutely no experience with the similarity standard that will be used for biologics, for the approval of biosimilars. So how can you be sure that a new and untested standard would not facilitate a path for patent workarounds for biologics. How can you be sure that the different nature of biologic patents in conjunction with the similarity standard would not facilitate patent workarounds? How can you be sure? And you know what? Guessing in this is not going to be good enough. I would challenge you to ingest what comes out without the kind of scrutiny of the FDA and comparing one with the other as if they are the same, as if it's apples and pears. It's not. How can you be sure that today's science and the scientific advances in the future would not make it easier for biosimilar companies to work around biologic patent claims? And, you know, I think that this is a real chink in the armor of the report, or just in the report, which I have to tell you, at 1:45 this morning, I thought really suggested a lot of guesswork on the part of the FTC. Let me hold something up. And I don't know if you had anyone come in and show you this. This is a regular drug, small molecule compound. This is tamoxifen. Look at it. It's all the same. This is Herceptin. This is Herceptin. This is Herceptin. If this picture doesn't speak 1,000 words, where you use the model throughout your report based on the generics of the small molecules and apply it to this, I want to tell you something. Patients are going to be in big trouble in this country. Patients are going to be in big trouble in this country. And if efficacy of this movement is not taken into consideration, God help us. Now, there's something else that has gone around in the committee for those that are opposed to my viewpoint, and they have every right to oppose it. But I want to, and there are other members that have touched on this. We cannot take for granted those that innovate to pursue the cure of these deadly diseases. The FDA is not going to do it. The Energy and Commerce Committee is not going to do it. We have a private sector that does it. Yes, there need to be new rules of the road because we want lower costs and safe products. But that role cannot be diminished. And I don't know, I looked at the back of your report. Did you have any people that do the investing in this come and be part of your roundtable? I didn't. If they were law firms, I didn't recognize them.
Let me just,
in my district. So,
we're like twice the time, so I'm just going to ask you to, I know you can't respond to everything, but.
Well, there was an assertion, Mr. Chairman.
But if you could just respond
that.
as quickly as you can, because we need to move on.
Okay, I will. There were just a number of assumptions. First of all, let me just apologize to you for the lack of time you had to read the report.
Well, why did that happen to begin with? Were you told? How long have you been working on this?
The commissioners received the report at 4 o'clock on Tuesday evening.
How long has the FTC been working on this report?
We announced our workshop because we had a public hearing in August of last year.
How long have you been working on it?
10 months.
10 months.
And it was finished on Tuesday.
You notified the committee that it was complete when?
Notified on the beginning of last week that it would be ready.
And it was ready Tuesday at 4 o'clock.
And did the FTC, was it the FTC that refused to put the report out to members, and only after cajoling that we finally got it, and that some of us took it home
Let me
to
be
read
really
last
clear.
night?
The report was finished Tuesday at 4 o'clock p.m. The commissioners of the Federal Trade Commission voted this Tuesday, this week, at 4 o'clock p.m. on the report. There were embargoed copies that went probably before we even voted on it, but it went to the full committee the very next day.
No.
No,
that's not so. That's
it was
incorrect.
voted on.
You know what? Let's
Tuesday.
get to the.
All right, but we have to
questions.
move on.
I'd like you to answer the questions that I.
Okay,
that I
there was
posed.
an assumption that was made. You said that the report applied the Hatch-Waxman framework in this context. It doesn't.
Similarities. I'm sorry. The identical standard, and use it and apply it to a similar standard.
The report actually did not say that. In fact, the approval pathway for biologics will be very different than the Hatch-Waxman approval process. And that's why I started by apologizing that you didn't get a chance to read the full report, because it doesn't say that the approval process is similar. It is not. In fact, we're advocating that a Hatch-Waxman approval process would not be appropriate in the case of follow-on biologics. And the reason we say that is because it mimics brand-to-brand competition.
I'm not talking about the approval process. I'm talking about the investment incentive. You all are the ones that are in charge of competition. That's why, I guess, you got involved in this whole issue. And
All right, we're going to, let me just,
think
if you just answer that, and then we have to move on. I'm just going to have to move to the next person.
What we did is we did look at the investment incentives for biologics and compared them to the investment incentives for a small molecule drug, the Hatch-Waxman type drug. And the research that we have that is out there, and I provided to your staff earlier, was that the actual time and the cost to develop a pioneer biologic drug versus a pioneer small molecule drug are the same.
All right, I have to go. Ms. Capps is the next for questions. Oh, he's deferring to you, so we'll let you go next.
Thank you. And thank you, Honorable Commissioner, for being here for this long. One of the reasons, I have 3 different questions to ask. One of the reasons that has been given for a 12 to 14-year exclusivity period is that without such a lengthy period, startup biotech companies will not be able to interest venture capitalists in investing in their companies, and without venture capital, these companies cannot survive. Some believe that this claim, that the specific number of years, is very difficult to evaluate. Before Congress makes a determination on exclusivity periods, this hearing is because we feel a duty to determine whether there is adequate evidence to support arguments in its favor. First question, did the evidence gathered by the FTC in the course of its investigation support the claims that venture capitalists will no longer invest in startup biotech companies without this 12 to 14 years of exclusivity?
We believe that patent protection will still provide those incentives. Patent protection plus market-based pricing will still provide those incentives for venture capitalists to invest in startup biotech ventures.
I know you've mentioned this already. I just wanted to get it clear from my perspective as well. Next question, is there evidence that startup biotech companies will still be able to recruit venture capital during a 5-year period comparable to what the traditional drugs have or the small molecule drugs have?
Yes, because the patent rights are still going to be strong.
Do you have evidence that this is the case?
Well, we've seen, if you take a look at the stock market in the biotech market, the stock prices only went down 15% compared with the general market indices.
So you're using that as
went
one
down
method
30%.
of your valuation?
There's probably more as well, but that's what comes to mind.
Are there others?
The only thing I was going to add was the venture capital that has come into the biotech industry in the past quarter has actually been very robust.
And now, right now, there's no 12 to 14-year exclusivity because that's what we're debating. So right now, they have nothing,
But
no
the patent
additional protection. Pardon?
And that's true. There is no 12 to 14 year
No, there's the same as the
but you still have
small
the patent
molecule.
protection. Right.
Right. Finally, another kind of tack. The FTC report concludes, as you just mentioned, that 12 to 14 years of exclusivity is unnecessary because patents and market-based principle pricing available under current law provide sufficient incentives for innovation. I'm particularly interested in one of your conclusions that giving an excessive period of exclusivity may, in itself, have negative consequences, and that may actually harm patients. This is a piece that I'd like you to spell out. what are some of these negative consequences, particularly how the length of exclusivity might decrease the number of medical breakthroughs, but also the particular, I know many people hang on to the hope that something's going to be available to them for their own, life-saving needs. And so these two aspects, additional breakthroughs that follow on behind some new discovery, oftentimes they do, and then the part that relates to the patient's own survival ability.
I would say that the 12 to 14 year exclusivity period could in fact slow the pace of innovation. So
Other companies will know they just can't even do anything for that long a time, so they won't try.
That's right. And ultimately, that is not good for the American consumer because you're not getting new drug products on
Right.
the market as quickly.
I know, especially because there are different criteria in other countries that sometimes people see availabilities in other places that they can't make available to themselves here, which creates quite a possible tragic situation, at least from their points of view. Although, to be sure, we want to make sure that our standards are ones that we set ourselves. Is there any evidence on the previous? Since I have just a few seconds left, that a long length of time of exclusivity would have this sort of chilling effect on additional innovations to that particular, so upgrading it or making it better or doing something different along the side of it. Sometimes different outcomes based on something that is set up in a particular, and they are very complex, will spin off into some other kind of breakthrough.
We've seen in other areas that whenever the exclusivity ends, that's when the innovation occurs. And so to the extent that the follow-on pathway that you're establishing still keeps intact those very robust incentives of patent protection and market-based pricing, then you'll have the threat of competition coming from behind acting. It's almost like carrots and sticks.
Mm-hmm.
With a carrot, that you have the ability to price at market, whatever the market will bear, for that period of time for your patent. And then you have the ability, or the competition can come on and hasten the development. That's a win-win for the consumers.
And one thing I want to add, the exclusivity is really additional protection over and above what the patent system provides. And the original rationale for the 12 to 14-year branded exclusivity period under Hatch-Waxman was to compensate for a perceived failure of the patent system. We haven't perceived that failure here with biologics and follow-ons.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Utah, Mr. Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In my opening statement, I mentioned that 80% of the biotech industry right now remain unprofitable. Is that consistent with what you've heard as well?
We've seen the same
Sure.
same statistics.
In the previous round of questions, you were asked for evidence about ability to attract capital. You mentioned recent stock performance and quarterly investment from venture funds. Do you think that short-term window of the last few months is really the best evidence you got for telling us that the investment incentives are right? Because I got to tell you, that doesn't sell me.
Sure, we can certainly provide you all the evidence. We're more than happy to give you the evidence.
Mr. Chairman, I think it'd be real helpful to, again, in future hearings, let's get some folks in the venture capital industry and let's get some other folks in here so we can have a broad discussion about what's really going on here. Because I do think we want to make sure when we're setting policy that we do set an environment that encourages that private sector investment in these areas. I think that'd be a useful tool. Right now, I want to ask a question. Right now in Europe, you've heard, and a number of people said this in their opening statements, that it's 10 to 11 years of data exclusivity. Have you, in your analysis, thought about how an exclusivity period that would, in the United States, would be lower than the European model, how that would affect U.S. competitiveness in this industry?
The European model is very different than for two reasons that we mentioned earlier. One was that the scope of the patent system is different in that, and that they have regulated prices in Europe. So with a 10-year period of exclusivity and only the ability to charge a regulated price as opposed to a price that the market would bear. And if they've developed a monopoly, it's a monopoly price, that market necessarily isn't, that model isn't necessarily as translatable here to the U.S.
Have you, in your analysis, have you seen where biotech industry is moving away from Europe and coming to the United States in previous years?
I think what we saw throughout the entire analysis was that biotech in many ways is a global industry, but that here in the United States, it's locally centered. So because of the strong collaborative efforts between universities, between startups that have talent to manage projects, that you have a collaboration. And so that's why you have in Wisconsin, you have a biotech industry.
Let me ask you,
Silicon Valley, the same
in
thing.
your analysis, did you look at why in terms of looking at why the Europeans set this data exclusivity level at 10 to 11 years, you've mentioned your issue about market pricing. Did you analyze other reasons why they set that exclusivity period where they did, and in fact was not one of the reasons because industries were leaving Europe and coming to this country?
When we spoke with the European regulators, they explained that their system was kind of a different system because they were incorporating not only biologics, but small molecule drugs too in that whole system. And that it was a different different dynamic than I think that we're facing here.
Let me ask you this question. Obviously, the committee's looking at different bills that look at data exclusivity. What are the factors you think we ought to be taking into consideration as a committee in terms of how we determine an appropriate length of exclusivity?
I think there are a couple things that we should look at. One, to see, when if there's a failing in the patent system because drugs are unpatentable, that's a serious flaw for all drug development, and there should be some type of mechanism to recoup and to encourage people or firms to engage in that clinical testing.
So are you suggesting it's more of a patent reform issue and not data of exclusivity? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
And you're saying that the fact the biologic industry maybe faces a different set of dynamics than conventional prescription drug industry, that this exclusivity issue is not an appropriate tool for us to acknowledge the challenges in the biotech industry?
We didn't see that the tools that we currently use to incentivize innovation, basically patents and the fact that you can price at the market, had somehow would fail with a biosimilar that wouldn't have nearly the dramatic market impact that a small molecule generic drug would have.
If you think that the intent is that we want to set up an appropriate opportunity for the private sector to recoup its R&D costs to develop one of these, are you telling me data of exclusivity is not an appropriate tool for us to be looking at?
I think it's an appropriate tool to look at if the other two tools which have been wildly successful are broken.
And you're suggesting they're broken?
Quite the opposite. I'm suggesting
Okay,
that they've been very strong.
I see my time's expired, Mr. Chairman, but I guess I'll reiterate what a number of folks have said. I think it would be helpful to bring some other folks in before this committee to get some other points of view, and I'll yield back my time.
Thank you. Before I ask Mr. Inslee, I know that my colleague from Georgia has a request.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have unanimous consent request that a report from Alex M. Brill, who is a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and a report from Lawrence L. Kitlikoff, professor of economics at Boston University, and a report from the AARP Public Policy Institute on biologics, that they be included in the record.
Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Inslee?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for allowing me to participate in this very important hearing, and I hope there are others on this line. This is a complex area. But there is one conclusion of this report that is so, in my view, fantastically unrelated to the realities of the marketplace. I've really got to question it. On page 7 of your executive report, I'll read you what it says. It says, central to each of these exclusivities is a public policy trade-off. A restriction on competition is provided in return for the development of a new underlying drug product or new underlying use of an existing product. A 12 or 14-year exclusivity period departs sharply from this trade-off because it does not spur the creation of a new, underlying new, biologic drug or indication. The drug has already been incentivized through patent protection and market-based pricing, close quote. Now that statement is so fantastically unrelated to reality, suggesting that the removal of the exclusivity period will help the incentivize further investment in new drugs to cure new diseases. Right now, if a drug company wants to go out there and develop a new drug that will cure leukemia, they have an incentive to investment in part because of data exclusivity. And yet you have turned that upside down and suggest by removing that data exclusivity, somehow you'll create an additional incentive for investment of a new drug. Now, a biologically similar drug is not going to cure a disease that hasn't already been dealt with by the original product. And I just cannot fathom how you make this argument that removing data protection is going to create greater incentive for investors to put money into products that will truly respond to this condition in a new way. I just think you've turned reality on its head in that regard. So I'll give you a chance to respond to that. I can't imagine what it will be, but take a shot.
Should I take? Let me take a shot first. Your question seems to presume that the patent system is not strong enough to protect patents. Basically, exclusivity is additional protection above and beyond what the patent system provides.
Well, but let me just ask you this. Don't you agree that data exclusivity is one of the things that investors take into consideration when they decide to plunk down several $1 million on something that may take a decade that may or may not work? Don't you think that's an incentive for investment in truly new drugs that truly treat conditions in a new way, which is the original patent holder that we're talking about here? Don't you agree with that?
No, only if there's truly a perceived failure with the patent system.
Well, then you do not have any, with all due respect, any recognition of the investment climate in the United States. If you do not recognize this as critical to inspiring investment in these truly new drugs. So let me ask you about that. Did your study evaluate the impact on the investment in new products, truly new products that will approach these conditions in a new way? Did you evaluate how that would affect the investment in these new products? And I mean new, that's not follow-on biologics. Did you?
We did not evaluate that in particular, and I'll tell you why. It's because the patent protection has been very, very strong. We've suggested, though, in the executive summary that one way to, if there's
I've got limited time. I think you've answered my question. I appreciate it. But the point I want to make is you assumed, for purpose of this study, that there's no impact. That's an assumption we can't make, because if you make that assumption and it's wrong, which I believe it is wholeheartedly wrong, you will cut off the development of new drugs because investments will not be made in them. So let me ask you a further question, Madam Commissioner. You told us that you consider yourself an expert on consumers. I'll give you a hypothetical consumer. Let's take parents of a 10-year-old kid with leukemia. And we are now evaluating risks when we consider this legislation. One of the risks is that we would continue data exclusivity, and the parents might have a 10 to 30% increased cost of a drug that might cure leukemia, and let's assume that there is one right now. The other risk is that a drug would never be created to cure leukemia, because by removing by removing data exclusivity, the investment never gets made to provide that life-saving drug. As an expert in consumer behavior, what do you think is more important in the bigger risk to those parents of that kid?
First of all, if I said I was an expert on consumers, I misspoke, but let me address.
Well, I think that was the director's
But
quote I could find.
I'm an expert on protecting the
Okay,
American
as an expert
consumer.
in protecting the consumer, what do you think would be a greater risk in the minds of the children or the parents of that child? The risk that they'd have a 10 to 30% higher cost of the drug, or the risk that this drug that could cure their child would never be created?
You are assuming that data exclusivity is the only way that one would invest in a drug, and that's what I am pushing back against.
Well,
I don't think that assumption is correct.
Unfortunately,
There are
apparently, according
exceptions, though, where if you have a small patient population, or if you are bringing drugs on the Orphan Drug Act, where exclusivity would be necessary because there is a perceived market failure. In that circumstance, exclusivity would be absolutely appropriate.
and the unfortunate limitation of your study, according to the one who just testified, you
I just
did
have
not
to-
study that
gentlemen,
issue.
I
Thank
think
you,
we'll
Mr. Chair. I appreciate your cooperation.
Okay. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just follow along that discussion that you were just having for a moment. Now, within the Federal Trade Commission, have you constructed a matrix that will give you a cost-benefit analysis? Some of the newer compounds, for example, that inhibit small blood vessel growth that may be used in treating more advanced cancers. Do you look at the number of hospital days that might be saved by using one of these advanced biologics and considering the cost? Yes, they're expensive, but the disease that they're treating also has expensive consequences associated with it, so that if we avoid a surgery, if we avoid a week in the hospital, there are additional savings. It's not just the baseline cost of the drug, but there are other things to consider. So is there a matrix or simulation or program that you use to help make those evaluations, or is this simply data that's derived from the price tag on the bottle or box that the drug comes in?
Those sort of questions sound like they're within the expertise of the FDA. We are looking at the
I'm
competitive.
so glad you brought that up, because, Mr. Chairman, we should be having this discussion with the FDA.
And perhaps you will. I mean, we are your beginning act here, and we are talking about the competitive consequences of this sort of follow-on. I believe there will be more hearings and discussions on these issues.
Now, do you and the FDA, are you aligned on your definition of things like biosimilar and biogeneric? Do you mean the same thing when you say those terms?
Yes.
I don't know. Seems like the FDA has hinted that it might be otherwise, but you feel that currently there's a scientific basis for determining interchangeability of biologics from different and unrelated manufacturers.
What we tried to do was to say if there is an abbreviated pathway where the follow-on does not have to duplicate findings of safety and effectiveness, because it can rely on the FDA's approval of the pioneer drug, if that's allowed.
Well, but
These are the
that's such a
competitive
crucial question, because the
consequences.
safety question can be very, very difficult to answer. And again, just as an aside, a week ago I was visiting the FDA, Dr. Hamburg, and getting a tour with her through the new facility that they're occupying out there. One of the researchers just passing in the hall said what a difficult time they were having because of the viruses that might infect the cell cultures that are going to create these monoclonal antibodies that might be useful in the treatment or prevention of Alzheimer's in the future. Well, that's a pretty important arm or branch of that research. And I don't know that he knows, or would be interested if he could tell us that, is this something that is so standard and so settled that you could do this in Dallas as well as Denver as well as Beijing and get the same result?
That's very important, and that certainly would be for the FDA, not the FTC, to determine the safety and efficacy of these follow-on biologics.
Again, we're hitting on a recurrent theme, Mr. Chairman. We need to have a hearing that involves the FDA, and many of us have been asking for that for some time. And again, I'll just emphasize that I've not aligned myself with either of the two bills that are out there. I'm really in an information gathering mode, and safety has to be paramount. The poor doctor that picks up the prescription and the pen and writes the prescription and rips it off and puts it in the patient's hand and counsels them his risks and benefits. We've got to be able to provide them the best data, and it isn't always just the price tag on the box of the bottle that the medication is going to be delivered in. What about, because this would come up all the time when I was a doctor and I was in practice for years, there were some classes of medicines, and these were not biologics, these were just regular things. But there were some classes of medicines where you just really didn't want to make a change. And if you didn't want a generic to be substituted. And some of those things might be some of the cardiac drugs, certainly some of the diuretics that treat congestive heart disease. And in my practice, different estrogens from different manufacturers actually seem to have a different biologic behavior. And I don't know whether it was a bioavailability or the vehicle or what it was. But how are we going to address that? A doctor who's got a patient who's on a very stable regimen, a patient with a serious and significant disease, and now a new biosimilar becomes available. How are we going to govern that? Because in the generic world, it became harder and harder for me to control that. And oftentimes I'd have to pick up the phone and call 1-800-California and stay on hold for a long time to get my point across.
We couldn't agree with you more that those types of switching are going to be very difficult to do in the biosimilar environment, and that's really one of the foundations that drew our conclusions that when a follow-on comes onto the market, that its market impact is going to be substantially different than a generic drug, the market impact that a generic drug has.
But when under the Hatchman or whatever it was, we lost the ability to control, the provider, the doctor lost the ability to control that. And again, you had to really intervene on your patient's behalf if you didn't want to have a substitution.
And there's no similar type mechanism in
Well, I think we heard that
biologics.
discussed this morning, that there would have to be ways of directing this behavior because you couldn't always trust doctors to do the right thing. Imagine that. Just one last point I'll make, and we heard the heparin tragedy a year ago in this very hearing room. The fact that oftentimes the active pharmaceutical ingredient, we only manufacture the compounds in this country, but actually the active pharmaceutical ingredient may come from overseas, and the ability of the FDA to monitor those manufacturing facilities that are overseas. And again, we saw a tragedy with heparin, which is not a complex molecule. It's a little bit more complex than aspirin, but would not fall into this category. And we saw what happened with the intrusion of a foreign substance into that active pharmaceutical ingredient. It just seems to me that this manufacturing process, which is fraught with much more peril, you've got to be much more precise. You don't just line up the amino acids and say, there, I've made the protein. It's the folding, the unfolding, the sulfide bonds, the hydrogen bonds. All of those things are going to be critical to the biologic action of that product. And again, all of which can be affected by the humidity, the atmospheric pressure, and goodness knows what else. We have an obligation to protect. You say you're the advocate for the consumer. I think, our first obligation has to be for the safety of that consumer, which is both the physician and the patient in that scenario.
And as an advocate for consumers, I think it's a good thing to discuss all of these issues. We are here discussing the competitive implications. Obviously, the safety implications are paramount. You can't pass go if there aren't safety implications. There needs to be a hearing on this potentially as well. But here, we can opine on those. We don't have the expertise to opine on the safety. The FDA would have to do that.
Well, thank you for your testimony, Mr. Chairman. Did you get that we need to have a hearing from the
I've
FDA?
repeatedly said that we're having more hearings, so no one is disagreeing with that notion, and I think it's pretty obvious that we have a lot of disagreements here and we need further hearings. Let me just thank both of you for being here. This has not been easy for you, but I appreciate your bearing with us. And as I mentioned before, we will undoubtedly have members asking in writing for you to respond to questions. Normally, the clerk, normally that's about 10 days, and the clerk will notify you within the next 10 days of any written questions that the members would have. But I cannot stress enough that I think that this report was really informative for me and the other members, and appreciate your bearing with us today. Thank you very much, and without further ado, this subcommittee hearing is adjourned.